All right, picking up from the last video, let's talk about capitalism's internal contradictions according to Marx. Now, when he says internal contradictions, what he's referencing is this idea that there is an imbalance in power between certain groups, and that creates conflict, which will create revolution and a change in the economic system. So systems like capitalism that have internal contradictions, they are primed for revolution and change. The proletariat. This is the social class that owns none of the means of production, other than their own labor, which they must rent to the capitalists to survive. It's the worker that has to rent the labor to the owner of capital, the business person, in order to provide for themselves. The bourgeoisie is the social class that owns a means of production. This is the employer. This is the capitalist. This is the entity that has the power in the system. Primitive accumulation. Capitalism is a system that allows the bourgeoisie to exploit the proletariat through their ownership of the input capital. What's happened, according to Marx, is the workers, who at one time would have been artisans, craftsmen, business owners themselves, small business owners, they've been removed from their tools, right? They've been removed from the implements, capital, that they would need to be productive. Because remember, in capitalism, private property rights are assigned to capital, along with land and intellectual property and the other things. But that private property ownership means that the capitalist can force the worker to come to work for them in order to be productive and survive. Labor is forced to work for the capitalist under the guise of free labor. So they're told that they're free. They're told, oh, you get to choose what job you want, right? Nobody forces you to work. But according to Marx, it's not the case. They're really not free, because if they choose not to work, they starve, right? So they have to work. It's exploitative, okay? And again, private property rights underlie this exploitation. Primitive accumulation is another way of saying that the bourgeoisie is able to accumulate that which is rightfully the proletariats, the workers, by creating a system or by perpetuating a system that prevents the proletariat from ever getting the means of production. Alienation. People become mere objects, cogs in a machine. They're removed from their innate talents, curiosity, and ingenuity. Marx found this offensive because he didn't attribute the same characteristics to people that we would attribute to machines. In other words, people should not be assembly line means of production. They shouldn't be doing mundane tasks over and over again throughout the day. They should be able to imbue their own talents and curiosities and abilities in their production. That's what he saw occurring before capitalism. Again, those artisans and those craftsmen, they were creating. They weren't just implementing. But under capitalism, the owners of capital, the bourgeoisie, they are forcing labor into the same role that capital has. Nothing more than cogs in a larger machine. This alienation doesn't just affect the worker, it affects the whole society. Because when you turn people into objects, they are treated as such. The bourgeoisie, they start to think of people in terms of their incremental production value, rather than thinking of them as human beings that are more equal and have equal rights. Okay? And so Marx saw this as a potential destruction of the community. Capitalism degrades the social fabric that unify people in non-monetary ways. The quality of society depends on its non-pecuniary, that means non-monetary relations. He sees capitalism as undermining that. So we're not just talking about workers having to work on the assembly line, because quite frankly, many of these workers actually have more income in a capitalist system, even though they're cogs in a machine, than they would have in a artisan craftsman kind of environment. Because not everybody is equally creative. Not everybody can produce things on their own that other people want to buy. So a lot of people would be very impoverished in systems prior to capitalism. Go back to feudalism and to slavery, and you start to see that capitalism is an improvement in productivity, and it is an improvement for the masses in terms of income. But that improvement may come with this alienation, and it may end up destroying the overall community. It dehumanizes people. And for Marx, there's more to life than just production, than just monetary value. There is the community, the human aspect to life that should not be devalued under the guise of increasing standards of living. These factors eventually catalyze conflict. Greater inequality increases, right? The power imbalances ensue where the capitalist bourgeoisie accumulates more wealth, more income, more influence, and they're able to oppress the worker to a greater extent. They do this typically by pushing wages lower and lower. It's like if you've separated the worker from their tools and they need you, then you can force them to take a lower wage to get those tools to survive. That worker immiseration eventually leads to a resistance, okay? Especially when the workers start to get paid below subsistence. As long as people are feeding, clothing, sheltering themselves, there may not be the same incentive to rebel than if they can barely survive. And you'll see this throughout history and across even countries today. There's almost a turning point for revolution when the people are so low in terms of their standard of living that they feel like they have nothing to lose, and they challenge that power. And for Marx, that's the beginning of the breakdown. If you look back at history, there's been many instances, even in the US, where Marxists have thought we will reach this turning point where capitalism was going to collapse. The Great Depression, even prior to that, World War I, then World War II. Even in the 90s and 2000s, when we saw some of the collapses in the stock market, people thought, well, this is the capitalist breakdown. And now, today, we see the potential for a turning point that some Marxists are suggesting. Because they say, look, the inequality is too abundant. Exploitation is now palpable, and you're going to have resistance. But it hasn't come to fruition in the U.S. Not to say that it won't, but according to Marx, it will inevitably. But it hasn't come to fruition yet. Whereas in some other countries, it has. I mean, World War I was a catalyst for Russia to turn into a Marxist state. Venezuela turned into a Marxist state under Hugo Chavez. And Cuba turned into a Marxist state in the 50s under the Castro brothers. So Marx also talks about the state. And the state is the government, who will implement policies amenable to the class that has power, right? Under slavery, the state was created for the benefit of the masters. Under feudalism, the state is created for the benefit of the lords, the kings. And under capitalism, the state is going to be created for the benefit of the capitalists. So, Marx would look at today and he would say, you don't have to think too hard to find the source of political power. Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, these are the people that have significant influence in our political system because they have the means, they own the capital. It's not your everyday ordinary worker. And someone like Marx would say, you throw a bone to the average person by saying you get to vote to determine who runs a state, when even he or she knows that they don't have the money, the funds to ever have any real influence in the system. Okay. Now be clear, this is Marxism. Okay. It's not to say that it's true. This is his perspective. A lot of debate over this. False consciousness. Both classes may actually fail to see the injustice in the system. This is very ironic because when you read Marx, you think, well, there's the bad guys, which are the bourgeoisie, the capitalists that are, almost with the Joker grin on their face, pushing down the wages and exploiting the worker. And the worker is this innocent victim that knows they're being taken advantage of. When, with false consciousness, that may not be the case at all. Both parties may not realize that there is this imbalance of power and that there is this injustice, this immorality within the system. So there's an innocence here among both parties, but most notably the oppressor. So for Marx, the person that goes out and starts a business becomes an oppressor, but they may not do it with any ill will. They're operating within a system that makes them powerful, that grants them an unjustifiable amount of influence, but they don't necessarily feel that way or see it that way. The superstructure reinforces this because it becomes the dominant ideology that the system is just. Remember, the art, the religion, the government, the education system are all reinforcing the validity of the system, of capitalism. And they're saying, look, upward mobility, rugged individualism, hard work, meritocracy, right? It's all available to you if you only do the things that are righteous and just within the system. So, the person that has a low-paying job and is working for a billionaire, they say, well, I can move up the ladder if I only do a lot of things. I get an education, I work hard and all of that. And the billionaire or millionaire, they say, look, hey, I want to help you. I want to give you a job. I want to give you the knowledge so that you can become successful. We can both do well in this system. When Marx would say, that's a false consciousness. Good intentions, bad results, because they don't see the conflict that is, festering underneath all of this. Eventually, the consciousness does arise. And when it does, that's when the revolution occurs. And what happens is, if we go back to the previous slide, the proletariat emerges. Technically, a worker is not a proletariat until they become conscious of the injustice in the system and they form the revolution. That's where Marx delineates between the two. So look, you're just an exploited worker that goes along with the system for a long time. But then at some point, you realize that you don't have that upward mobility. The system is rigged against you and it is unjust. And at that point, you become a proletariat because the light bulb went off and now you form the revolution and catalyze the change to socialism. So again, Marx doesn't elaborate a whole lot on what comes after capitalism. His emphasis is on the injustices of capitalism and how we got to that point. But we can speculate, and there's certainly been post-Marxists that have talked a lot about what socialism will look like. But I want to be clear, socialism is not communism in this theory of history. Socialism is one step in the evolution away from capitalism, but it's not the ultimate state, okay? For socialists today, post-World War I to the present would represent socialism in certain areas of the world, okay? Where you have the USSR, you have again Cuba, Venezuela, and some other countries here and there. Not all of them have sustained socialism, but they have tried. State-planned economy via a decentralized council or committees, so the state becomes more dominant. In fact, what happens in this evolution is as the capitalist and worker, as the conflict ensues, the state becomes the means through which the worker takes control. The power imbalance under capitalism is the rich versus the poor. So the poor, they can't get the wealth without force, and they do that through taking back the state. That's why government becomes so integral in a socialist system. All right, let's pick up there in the next video.